Along the humid coastal plantations of McIntosh County, Georgia, the archives from the 1830s contain a peculiar and unsettling detail, one that appears not once, but in 17 separate ledgers preserved across scattered estate records. Hidden between routine entries of crop yields, weather notes, and inventory lists, there exists a set of physical measurements that defy every expectation of the era. A chest measuring 48 inches, arms 19 inches around, shoulders spanning 23 inches. These were the recorded dimensions of a woman whom the plantation owners called their greatest investment. What made these records extraordinary was not merely their size, though they were remarkable for any woman of that time, but what they symbolized. They represented the outcome of a deliberate, multi-generational experiment in human breeding, conducted with cold precision by 3 generations of the Harrow family. The woman behind these measurements would later be known in the surviving ledgers only as number 47, a designation that stripped away her identity, her heritage, and her humanity. Yet the fragmentary documents that remain speak to a story far larger than a set of numerical entries, one that forces us to confront unsettling truths about cruelty, survival, and the lengths people will go to reclaim their stolen humanity. Even now, the coastal humidity of Georgia seems to cling to the brittle pages of those ledgers, as if the air itself has preserved the memory of suffering. Anyone who handles the documents describes a lingering smell, old ink, mixed with damp paper and something else, something harder to name. A heaviness, a shadow, a reminder of lives reduced to measurements in breeding journals. Maritime historians familiar with the region speak about the Harrow records only in hushed tones. Some researchers refused to continue once they understood the full scope of what had been done. Others said nothing at all, simply closing the journals as though shutting a door on a ghost. The records themselves abruptly end in 1847, a silence that raises more questions than answers. Yet what they reveal before that date is chilling enough. A blueprint of obsession so calculated that it transforms the plantation from a site of forced labor into a laboratory where the enslaved were treated as livestock to be improved, manipulated, and shaped by generational design. The Harrow plantation was built between the Altamaha River and the Atlantic coast, an expanse of nearly 2,000 acres where the air hung heavy with salt and the constant hum of insects never ceased. By 1810, the plantation's founder, Alexander Harrow, had turned the marshlands into thriving rice fields through a labor system that demanded brutal physical endurance. Workers stood all day in knee-deep water while scorching heat, swarming mosquitoes, and rampant disease turned every hour into a test of survival. But Alexander's ambition went beyond wealth. During an 18-month trip to Jamaica in 1807-1808, he encountered a practice whispered about among plantation elites, selective breeding of enslaved people, meant to produce individuals with superior strength, endurance, or size. It was a grotesque fusion of agricultural logic and human exploitation. Alexander returned to Georgia with 3 leather-bound journals filled with observations and theories. He detailed which pairings had produced strong offspring, which physical traits seemed reliably hereditary, and which conditions increased the likelihood of producing desirable children. His wife, Charlotte, recoiled at the journals and refused to discuss them, but Alexander did not need her approval. This was work he intended to conduct without interference. The plantation mirrored his worldview. The main house, built in grand Georgian style with sweeping verandas and imported furniture, stood in stark contrast to the cramped, deteriorating wooden quarters where 300 enslaved people lived. The physical layout of the land itself, elegance towering over enforced poverty, was a calculated symbol of the hierarchy Alexander believed nature demanded. Alexander kept meticulous records of every enslaved person, their skills, their illnesses, their family connections. Yet behind locked doors in his private study, he kept a second set of journals, those dedicated to his breeding program. These contained charts of measurements, family lineages, reproductive plans, and evaluations of physical traits. He measured children as they grew, examined adults for bone structure and muscular potential, and controlled every aspect of reproduction among the enslaved families he selected for his experiment. Among the enslaved community, traditions persisted despite being deliberately suppressed. African cultural memory lived on through stories, songs, spiritual practices, and the leadership of elders like Zina, a respected midwife born in West Africa who had survived the Middle Passage. She saw what Alexander was building long before anyone else fully understood it, and her quiet resistance, teaching, remembering, preserving, became one of the few forces pushing back against a system designed to erase identity. Alexander's work did not end with him. Upon his death, the journals passed to his son Marcus Harrove, who elevated the breeding program to a new level of systematic cruelty. Marcus expanded it, refined it, and documented it with an almost scientific obsession, a legacy that would eventually shape the life of the woman known as Number 47. By the time Alexander Harrove's son, Marcus, inherited the plantation in 1825, the obsession that had once lived quietly inside his father's leather-bound journals had transformed into a fully institutionalized system woven into the daily rhythm of the land. Marcus had grown up studying those journals the way other young men studied scripture, absorbing every calculation and theory until the breeding program seemed to him not a moral abomination, but an inevitable step in what he liked to call agricultural progress. He was 23 when he took control, young, ambitious, and utterly convinced that his father had only begun to unlock the secrets of improving human labor through hereditary design. Where Alexander had worked quietly and cautiously, Marcus was bolder, expanding the experiment to include more families, more measurements, more forced pairings, and far more detailed record-keeping. He hired an overseer, Klaus Reinhardt, a German immigrant who had worked on a horse breeding farm in Pennsylvania and saw no ethical difference between improving animals and improving enslaved people. Reinhardt brought with him instruments for measuring bone width, limb circumference, and chest expansion. He kept journals written in beautiful, precise handwriting that documented the enslaved population with a cold detachment that sent a chill even through those who read the ledgers years later. Children were measured beginning at age 3. Adults were assigned reproductive partners based on Marcus criteria rather than emotional bonds. Families were separated without hesitation when traits did not pass reliably to offspring, and pregnancies were monitored not with compassion, but with the scrutiny reserved for livestock. What made this system particularly haunting was the way it existed alongside the rich cultural life of the quarters, where enslaved people held tightly to fragments of African heritage. They sang work songs layered with coded messages, told ancestral stories under the faint light of pine torches, and wove baskets from sweetgrass and palmetto fronds, creating artistry that carried meanings overseers never understood. Their dialect, blending African languages with English, moved in musical rhythms that preserved identity even under the weight of constant surveillance. At the center of this cultural resistance remained Zina, the midwife who had witnessed births, deaths, and the painful unraveling of families for decades. She saw Marcus' expanding program with increasing dread, understanding that it represented a new level of cruelty, one not driven by anger or impulse, but by careful, generational calculation. She warned younger people quietly, reminding them that their condition was not natural but enforced, urging them to remember names, stories, and bloodlines even when owners tried to rewrite those connections into breeding charts. Within this fragile balance between survival and memory lived a woman named Dinina, tall and strong even by community standards, nearly 6 feet in height despite the poor nutrition that stunted most enslaved children. Marcus noticed her immediately after assuming control. He saw in her the physical characteristics his father had prized. Her partner, a man known in records only as Big Tom, was even larger, standing 6'4" with powerful shoulders and arms developed from years of field labor. Their union, one of the few formed by personal choice, aligned conveniently with Marcus' breeding goals, and he allowed it to continue with barely concealed anticipation. In March 1826, under the low roof of the birthing room, filled with the earthy smell of straw and the anxious whispers of midwives, Dinina delivered a daughter whose size was immediately striking. Zina, who had caught countless infants through the years, felt the unsettling weight of premonition when she held the baby, long-limbed, unusually strong, crying with a force that filled the cramped room. Before mother and child had even rested, Reinhardt arrived with his tape measures, scales, and journals, inspecting the newborn with professional detachment while noting every detail: length, weight, bone structure, proportions. His expression revealed something like triumph. By sunset, Marcus himself appeared in the doorway, too proud to enter a space he considered beneath him, yet unable to resist witnessing what he believed to be the first truly significant result of his program. He issued instructions immediately: extra rations for mother and child, weekly measurements for the first year, monthly thereafter, specialized physical tasks once the girl reached suitable age. And then he assigned her the designation that would come to define her existence: number 47. In the official records, she would never be Sarah, the name Dinina whispered to her in the quiet privacy of the quarters. She would be a number, a data point, a generational project. That very night, as the newborn slept in her mother's exhausted arms, the entire plantation shifted. In the main house, Marcus pored over charts and lineage notes, projecting the child's future with the same excitement a scientist might feel upon discovering proof of a long-held theory. In the quarters, people whispered to one another, some with fear, others with bitter resignation, and a few with quiet hope that the baby's exceptional strength, however cruel its origins, might someday become something more than what Marcus intended. Zina stood over the sleeping infant, sensing the weight of a destiny neither the Harrows nor the community fully understood yet, and prayed silently that whatever strength the child possessed would one day serve a purpose far greater than the ambitions of the man who had calculated her existence. Long before she drew her first breath, by the time the child privately called Sarah by her mother began to grow into her early years, the differences that had been measured and predicted on paper became strikingly visible in the living world of the plantation. As she moved from infancy into childhood, every milestone arrived earlier, every physical shift more dramatic, and every demonstration of strength more pronounced than anything Marcus Harrow had dared to imagine when he first assigned her the cold designation of number 47. By age 2, she spoke clearly and confidently in both the Gullah influenced dialect of the quarters and standard English, absorbing language with an ease that unsettled Reinhardt, who preferred his subjects to remain distant from intellectual development. By age 3, she lifted objects that other children struggled to drag along the ground, and by age 5, she stood nearly 4 feet tall, a height that matched children several years older, while her arms, chest, and shoulders developed a natural muscle tone that looked shockingly mature for someone who had barely begun childhood. Yet none of these features shaped her life as profoundly as the relentless attention that followed her. Reinhardt measured her weekly, sometimes twice a week, calling her into the small office he used for what he called development tracking. She learned to climb the wooden platform where he took measurements without being told, though each time she did so, she felt the uneasy gaze of men who saw her not as a child, but as an experiment unfolding exactly as they wished. She was made to stand still as Reinhardt wrapped measuring tape around her chest and arms, noted her height against the marked wall, and tested her grip strength with rusted iron rods. Sarah learned early to keep her face blank, knowing that any sign of discomfort, anger, or fear would be interpreted not as emotion but as behavioral data. Outside those suffocating sessions, her life stretched between two worlds. In the quarters, she absorbed the stories passed down by elders, the rhythms of work songs, the hidden meanings woven into lines that disguised messages of resistance and survival. Other children watched her with a mix of awe and distance, some intimidated by her size, others unsure of how to behave around someone treated differently by both overseers and community members. Many adults, though compassionate, maintained a gentle caution around her, understanding too well what it meant for a child to be the focus of a plantation owner's obsession. Her differences were not simply her own to bear. They affected everyone who lived with the knowledge that she was the living embodiment of the Harrow breeding program. At 7, when most enslaved children were given light tasks such as carrying water or gathering small bundles of kindling, Sarah's assignments were deliberately designed to build strength. She carried heavy rice sheaves, dragged oversized baskets, and performed tasks typically reserved for adolescent boys. Reinhardt observed these tasks closely, recording how long she could sustain work and how much weight she could lift before showing fatigue. These observations were passed regularly to Marcus, who began to imagine the plantation not merely as a site of labor, but as a model for a new philosophy of enslaved workforce design. The community around her watched each demonstration with heavy hearts, proud of her abilities, yet devastated by the knowledge that every ounce of strength she gained would deepen the chains placed on her life. As Sarah grew, so did Marcus desire to display her achievements. He began inviting plantation owners from neighboring counties, guiding them through the rice fields before presenting Sarah as though she were a rare and valuable breed of livestock. She learned to dissociate during these exhibitions, letting her mind drift into protective stillness as her body lifted sacks of rice, hauled barrels of water, and allowed men to inspect her physique. Their conversations, spoken openly as though she were deaf to human meaning, taught her more than they intended. She learned that they calculated her worth in dollars and breeding potential, that they debated whether her strength proved her mother's bloodline could be replicated, and that Marcus believed she represented the future of engineered labor. These humiliations carved deep emotional scars into Sarah, but they also sharpened her perception and carved into her a quiet, growing fury. She was not only strong in body, she was becoming strong in mind, in silence, and in the ability to read danger with the instinct of someone who had never been allowed to exist simply as herself. By age 10, Sarah towered at 5'6", her arms thick with developing muscle, her shoulders broad enough to rival grown men, and her presence so commanding that even overseers found themselves startled by her physicality. Yet she moved with gentleness among those she trusted, helping older women lift water pails, steadying children as they climbed steps, and carrying burdens not because she was told to, but because instinctively she felt responsible for others. She lived in a world that feared her potential, yet she used that potential quietly to comfort those who feared the consequences of her existence. Zena saw in Sarah not just a dangerous creation of the Harrows, but a young girl with a spirit deeper than the cruelty shaping her development. She whispered lessons into Sarah's ear about patience, reminding her of resistance movements across the South, stories of people like Denmark Vesey and Nat Turner, warning her that courage without strategy was death, but strategy without courage was surrender. These teachings planted the first seeds of future rebellion inside Sarah's mind, yet the more she grew, the more Marcus planned for her future. At 11, he began selecting potential male partners from among the strongest boys of the plantation, marking their names in notebooks as if preparing breeding charts for horses. Sarah heard whispers of these plans long before Marcus confirmed them in his journals, and each whisper deepened her dread and her rage. Her adolescence unfolded under the tightening grip of a destiny chosen by others, a path engineered from the day she was born. Still, she walked through those years with a quiet watchfulness, absorbing every cruelty, every humiliation, every injustice, not as defeat, but as memory, as fuel, as preparation for a moment she did not yet fully understand but already anticipated with a clarity that frightened even herself. As Sarah entered her 12th year, the physical changes that had always set her apart became impossible for anyone on the plantation to ignore. And with each inch she grew, the atmosphere around her tightened like a rope, slowly coiling around a struggling body. At 6 feet tall and still rising, she moved through the quarters with a presence that made children stare in awe and adults exchange anxious glances, not merely because of her remarkable strength, but because of what her existence represented, proof that Marcus Harrow's experiment was succeeding far beyond what had once seemed possible. Reinhardt documented her growth with a feverish enthusiasm, filling page after page with measurements, physical tasks, endurance tests, sketches of her bone structure, and predictions about her future reproductive capability, which he discussed openly with Marcus as though she were a prized broodmare rather than a human child. The more Sarah overheard these conversations, the more she felt the bars of an invisible cage closing around her. She began noticing how Marcus watched her not simply with pride but with ownership, as if every inch of her height, every new muscle, every display of strength belonged to him alone. His gaze clung to her movements with unsettling interest, especially after gatherings where neighboring plantation owners marveled at her development and speculated about breeding her at 14 or 15 to accelerate the results of the Harrow lineage. These gatherings grew more frequent, and each one felt like a small auction, a display of the future Sarah was being forced toward, a future she had never chosen. Yet despite their dehumanizing intentions, Sarah's mind sharpened with each passing month. She became increasingly observant, absorbing secrets spoken carelessly around her, reading the shifting tones of overseers, understanding the daily patterns of the plantation with a keen awareness born from necessity. She noticed which guards drank too much, which locks were rusting, which doors creaked, which supply sheds had loose boards, and which paths through the rice marshes offered visibility and which offered shadow. These observations rooted themselves in a quiet corner of her mind, not as plans yet, but as possibilities. Zena, watching Sarah's evolution with both fear and pride, intensified her teachings. She spoke to her in the deep hours of the night, in whispers thick with old wisdom, telling her that strength meant nothing without purpose, and that anger meant nothing without direction. She told Sarah stories of ancestors who had resisted in ways large and small, who had carved out survival even under the most suffocating conditions, and who had passed down courage like an heirloom through generations. Sarah listened with a hunger that had nothing to do with rebellion alone. She listened because these stories reminded her that she was more than an experiment, more than a set of measurements in a ledger. She was part of a lineage older and stronger than any plantation master, but even as these seeds of resistance were planted, Marcus was preparing a new phase of control. At 13, Sarah's daily work assignments were replaced with formal conditioning sessions, as Reinhardt called them, structured routines designed to measure her limits and push her beyond them. She carried logs heavier than anything a grown man usually moved, hauled stones across long distances, practiced repetitive lifting exercises, and was made to bend wrought iron bars to test the strength in her wrists and forearms. These sessions left her exhausted, her muscles burning, her throat raw from breathing in dust and heat. Yet she learned to perform them without revealing weakness. Years of emotional restraint had trained her to keep her face unreadable, her thoughts shielded, her pain locked behind a silent willpower that both terrified and fascinated the men who watched her. But what horrified Sarah most was not the physical labor. It was the growing certainty that Marcus planned to breed her sooner than anyone expected. She overheard him one evening through the thin wooden wall of the office, speaking to Reinhardt about selecting a partner for her genetic potential. And the way he discussed her body made her stomach twist with revulsion. She was no longer merely a subject of observation. She was becoming the central pillar of Marcus's multi-generational vision, the cornerstone of a dynasty of engineered strength. The thought made her chest tighten with a rage she had no safe place to release. She confided these fears to Xena, who listened with tears shining in her clouded eyes, and whispered that Sarah must find patience, not surrender, but patience, because rushed rebellion was suicide, and calculated rebellion was freedom. Even the enslaved community felt the tightening pressure around Sarah. They sheltered her as best they could, offering gentle smiles, extra food, whispered encouragement, and protective glances whenever overseers approached. Yet they too carried fear. Fear that if Sarah rebelled openly, Marcus would punish the entire community. Fear that her strength might provoke consequences beyond anything they had endured before. Still, the community recognized something extraordinary forming in Sarah. Not only physical might, but a presence that drew people toward her, a strength that was beginning to transcend muscle and bone. And while Marcus saw her as a creation, they saw her as a future. That future took a darker turn the day Sarah overheard the final confirmation of Marcus's intentions. She was to be bred at 14, paired with a selected male who had been monitored for similar traits, forced into a fate designed before she was even born. That night, lying awake under the cracked roof of her cabin, listening to the ocean wind rustle through the pine trees, Sarah realized that the moment Xena had warned her about, the moment when strength, memory, rage, and purpose would fuse, was approaching faster than she had told herself to believe. And for the first time, instead of fear, she felt something else rising inside her, readiness. As Sarah stepped into her 14th year, standing now at nearly 6 feet 4 inches with shoulders broad enough to rival any grown man on the plantation, the air around her seemed to thicken with unspoken tension, a heaviness shaped by the knowledge that the moment Marcus Harrove had been preparing for since the day of her birth was drawing dangerously close. Every glance Marcus cast toward her had shifted from observational pride to a possessive calculation. The look of a man who believed his theories, his legacy, and his legacy's proof, lived within the body of a girl who despised everything he represented. Reinhardt grew more meticulous in his measurements, more demanding during conditioning sessions, pushing Sarah through longer endurance tests, making her lift iron contraptions he built specifically to challenge the strength she had developed. Yet, with every task she completed, every new milestone she surpassed, every moment she proved stronger than what even the journals had predicted, Sarah felt not pride, but a deepening sense of imprisonment. Her body was becoming the very thing that threatened to cage her forever. Meanwhile, whispers seeped through the quarters, quiet, frantic conversations among the enslaved community who feared what would happen once Marcus officially moved forward with his plan to breed Sarah. Mothers clutched their children more tightly, fathers exchanged grim looks of warning, and elders prayed silently in the shadows for protection over a girl who had become more symbol than child. Yet despite their fear, the community also recognized in Sarah the possibility of something powerful and transformative, something that the Harroves had created without understanding the magnitude of what they were shaping. Sarah moved through these whispered currents with growing awareness, realizing that her life no longer belonged solely to her. Her fate was intertwined with everyone who lived on that land, everyone who looked at her with hope, fear, or desperate belief that she might one day break the chain none of them had been able to break. Xena, growing frailer with age yet still carrying the authority of a spiritual anchor, watched Sarah closely during this period, studying the shifts in her expression, the way she examined the plantation layout, the way her breath grew slower and deeper whenever she felt anger rising. Xena recognized the signs, not of rebellion alone, but of transformation. She pulled Sarah aside one humid evening under the low, fading light of the sinking sun and told her that destiny was like a river. It carved its path regardless of the rocks thrown into it. But those who understood its currents could learn when to swim, when to dive, when to let the water carry them, and when to rise against it. Sarah listened silently, absorbing every word, feeling a storm gathering inside her chest. A storm she knew she could no longer suppress entirely. That storm intensified the day she discovered Marcus's final decision, not by overhearing it this time, but through Reinhardt himself, who summoned her to the measurement room with an unusual stiffness in his posture. He measured her with trembling hands, not from fear of her strength, but from fear of what Marcus had demanded. The breeding was officially scheduled to begin soon. Reinhardt avoided Sarah's eyes, knowing the cruelty of what he was participating in, yet unwilling to defy Marcus. When Sarah walked out of the room, her heartbeat thudded so hard she felt it echo through her skull. She walked past the fields, past the drying racks, past the cabins, barely aware of the children calling her name or the women watching her with tearful pity. She felt only the tightening in her chest, the deepening throb of rage in her veins, a reaction so intense that it frightened her. Yet it also awakened something inside her she had never felt before. That night, the moon hung low, a pale, sickle-shaped blade slicing through the dark clouds as if the sky itself were warning her of the violence woven into her future. Sarah lay awake staring at the rafters, her breath slow, controlled, her hands clenched so tightly that her palms burned. She imagined the future Marcus intended for her, the forced pairings, the pregnancies designed like experiments, the endless cycle of bearing children who would be taken, measured, shaped, and used just as she had been. The thought made her muscles tense until her entire body trembled with a fury she could no longer hide from herself. She knew then that the time for patience Xena had preached was coming to an end. She was no longer a child waiting helplessly for fate to decide her path. She was a towering force, strong, strategic, aware, watching, and she began to understand that strength given to her by cruelty could become the weapon that destroyed that very cruelty. But strength alone would not be enough. Survival demanded calculation, timing, and silence. So Sarah rose before dawn, before the roosters called, before the overseers stirred, and walked quietly through the gray-blue shadows of the quarters toward the old storage shed behind the rice mill, a place she had studied for years, a place with loose boards and weak hinges. Inside she found what she expected: rusted tools, ropes, wooden stakes, farming blades dulled by years of neglect. She touched each one with slow, testing hands, not choosing, not yet deciding, just understanding what existed around her. And for the first time, she let herself imagine something she had never allowed her mind to fully form: escape, not just for herself but for others, maybe even something larger than escape. But the foundation of all that possibility began in that dark shed, with her hands brushing over tools that were never meant for rebellion yet seemed to pulse with the promise of it. As she stepped back into the early morning light, a quiet certainty settled into her bones. Marcus Harrove believed he had engineered Sarah for his legacy. He did not realize he had engineered the beginning of his downfall. In the weeks that followed Sarah's secret visit to the old storage shed, her inner world shifted in ways no measurement Reinhardt scribbled into his journals could capture, for she had crossed an invisible threshold between endurance and intention, between surviving and preparing, and though she continued moving through the plantation as quietly and obediently as she always had, something in her gaze had changed, sharp, calculating, awake in a way that made the elders in the quarters exchange wary glances, sensing that she was standing on the edge of a future that could either destroy her or free her. Sarah became more observant than ever, studying the plantation with a tactical awareness no one suspected existed behind her calm expression. And every day she added new pieces to an internal map that only she could see: the exact hours when the guard shifts changed, the moments Reinhardt left his office unattended, the way Marcus locked his study door but often forgot to latch the window, the weaknesses in the fencing near the marsh, the behavior of the watchdogs who could be distracted with scraps of salted meat. She learned which workers in the fields were trusted with extra privileges, which ones were beaten more frequently, and for what reasons, how rumors spread, how secrets disappeared, and which people could maintain silence when silence was all that kept them alive. At the same time, Marcus grew increasingly excited as he finalized his plans to breed Sarah, discussing them with an eagerness that made her stomach churn with revulsion. He began selecting stronger adolescent boys, lining them up during his inspections with the same calculating eye he used when choosing horses, and Sarah saw the shame burning in the boys' eyes as they realized what role Marcus intended for them. They avoided her gaze out of humiliation, not because they blamed her, but because they felt powerless, trapped in a destiny forged by a man who believed he could bend bloodlines to his will. The tension across the plantation became so thick that even children sensed the shift, speaking less, laughing less, watching adults with wide, frightened eyes, as though waiting for a storm none of them could fully describe. And that storm arrived the night Sarah nearly snapped. It happened during one of Reinhardt's evening conditioning sessions, when he ordered her to lift a custom-made iron contraption heavier than anything she had ever moved. Her muscles strained, veins rising along her arms as she pushed through the weight, and when she finally succeeded, dropping the contraption to the ground with a loud metallic crash, Reinhardt clapped with a smug pride that made her skin crawl. "Marcus will be pleased," he muttered, and something inside Sarah cracked, not physically, but emotionally, silently, like a thin line in glass spreading outward until the entire surface trembles. She felt an overwhelming urge to grab the iron bar and crush Reinhardt's skull, to silence him forever, to destroy the man who had spent her entire life treating her like an animal bred for conquest. For a split second her hands twitched toward the weapon, but she stopped herself, not out of fear. She had long stopped fearing Reinhardt, but because Zena's voice echoed through her mind, reminding her that rage without control was exactly what Marcus expected from someone like her. He wanted her to be monstrous, dangerous, wild. He wanted an excuse to chain her, to break her, to isolate her until she became easier to manage. Killing Reinhardt would not free her. It would spring the trap Marcus had already prepared. So she swallowed the rage until it burned in her throat like hot ash, bowed her head obediently, and walked out of the room with her fists clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. That night she visited Zena again, and though the old woman could barely stand without leaning on her cane, her eyes remained sharp, glowing like embers beneath failing flesh. Sarah told her everything, her anger, her near violence, her torment, her fear of losing herself before she had a chance to fight for anything. Zena placed her wrinkled hands on Sarah's enormous ones and spoke with the calmness of someone who had lived through suffering that would have crushed lesser spirits. She told Sarah that storms often feel most violent right before rain breaks the sky open, and that strength is not proven by the ability to strike, but by the ability to wait until striking becomes purpose instead of impulse. These words grounded Sarah more deeply than she realized. Over the next days she found herself thinking not only of escape but of strategy, of how much she needed allies, even if she could not openly ask for them. Quietly, she observed who among the workers moved with resentment in their steps, who flinched whenever Marcus appeared, who whispered of freedom even when it seemed impossible. She noticed the young man named Laron, quick with his hands and quicker with his silence, who often slipped food to others without being seen. She noticed Bessie, a woman who had lost 2 children to Marcus's breeding plans and whose grief had transformed into cold, simmering rage. She noticed old Tamber, who worked near the storage sheds and knew every lock and hinge better than any overseer. Sarah did not speak her intentions to them. Doing so would place them all in danger, but she watched them, and they watched her, and something unspoken began to form between them. Meanwhile, Marcus prepared for the breeding announcement, with disturbing enthusiasm, arranging for neighboring plantation owners to attend as witnesses to what he considered a historic moment. He sharpened his speeches, polished the journals his father had written, rehearsed his justification for the program he believed would revolutionize slavery across the South. But Marcus did not know that the girl he believed he controlled had already marked the date of the event not as the beginning of his triumph, but as the deadline for her freedom. And as the night air thickened with the scent of wet grass and distant ocean wind, Sarah understood with absolute clarity that waiting any longer would only tighten the chain around her neck. So the storm within her steadied, sharpened, and transformed from emotion into decision. In the final days before Marcus's grand gathering, the plantation carried an eerie stillness, as if every tree, every cabin, every rusted hinge knew that something irreversible was approaching, and beneath that silence pulsed a tension so thick Sarah could feel it pressing against her skin like humidity before a storm breaks open the sky. She moved through those days with a calmness that surprised even her, a silence sharpened not by fear but by absolute focus. For the plan forming in her mind was no longer a vague possibility or a desperate hope. It was something living and breathing inside her, something she felt growing stronger. With every sunrise, she chose her steps carefully, never rushing, never drawing attention, allowing Marcus and Reinhardt to believe she remained obedient, resigned, predictable. They had no idea she was watching everything, memorizing the schedules of the guards, the patterns of movement around the main house, the way the routes changed at dusk, the areas left unpatrolled when the men grew tired from the heat. She timed their distractions, their arguments, the moments when they left keys hanging on hooks or tossed them carelessly onto tables. She memorized which overseers were lazy, which ones fell asleep in their chairs after drinking too much whiskey, and which ones wandered off to meet the women from nearby plantations in secret. Each observation became a thread, and Sarah wove those threads into a rope of strategy she planned to climb when the moment arrived. Meanwhile, the enslaved community watched her with a mix of awe and fear, sensing the shift in her more clearly than any overseer ever could. They saw the tightening in her jaw, the way she stared at the horizon at night, the way her muscles seemed coiled like a panther preparing to leap. Some feared she would bring destruction upon them all, while others whispered prayers for her success, believing that if anyone could break the chains of the Harrow's cruelty, it was the girl who had been shaped by that cruelty into something beyond their understanding. Children followed her with wide, hopeful eyes. Adults pretended not to notice her intensity, knowing that acknowledging it out loud might tempt fate. And Zena, frail, coughing, spending more time seated than standing, watched Sarah with an expression both proud and heartbroken, knowing that the child she once held in her wrinkled arms was no longer a child at all, but a force no one, not even the Harrows, could contain much longer. On the morning of the planned gathering, Marcus was nearly shaking with excitement as he inspected the fields and supervised preparations, ensuring every path was cleared, every chair arranged beneath the veranda, every ledger displayed to impress the guests. He wanted the Harrow legacy to be recognized, admired, envied. He had no idea it was about to be shattered. Sarah moved through her tasks as usual, but deep within her something pulsed with silent fire. Every breath she took felt deliberate, every movement grounded, as if her bones themselves were preparing for what came next. By late afternoon, the plantation filled with visitors, wealthy white men in long coats despite the heat, their wives fanning themselves while whispering judgment about every detail. Their carriages lined the path like iron insects. Their presence alone made the enslaved workers stiffen with dread. Reinhardt stood near the main house, fussing over his measurement notes, rehearsing the presentation he and Marcus would deliver when they finally unveiled Sarah like a prized possession. Sarah stayed in the shadows near the rice mill, watching everything with the stillness of someone waiting for a signal only she could hear. And that signal came unexpectedly from the person she least expected to give it. Old Tamber, the quiet, limping man who had worked behind the storage sheds for decades, approached her with slow, careful steps, glancing around to ensure no overseer was watching. Without speaking a word, he pressed something small and metallic into her palm, the master key to the livestock gate near the outer fence, a gate Sarah had known for years was rarely guarded but always locked. She looked into his sunken, weary eyes, and the unspoken message between them was clear. Now, she closed her fingers around the key, and something inside her chest clicked into place. As the sun lowered and the guests gathered on the veranda, Sarah was summoned to the main yard where she was expected to stand beside Marcus and Reinhardt during their self-congratulatory speech. She walked slowly, her steps heavy, but her mind racing with every calculated detail she had memorized over the past months. The guards were distracted. The overseers were scattered. The crowd's attention would be focused entirely on the spectacle Marcus planned to create. And the livestock gate sat in the distance, its key now burning cold and powerful in her palm. When she reached the center of the yard, Marcus began speaking with theatrical pride, boasting about generational breeding, claiming he had proven nature could be perfected with intelligent guidance. While guests murmured in admiration, some even leaning forward to stare at Sarah with unsettling fascination. Reinhardt presented his charts, his measurements, his sketches. He gestured toward Sarah's height, her strength, her build. He spoke about her like she was a creature, not a human being, and the longer they spoke, the more Sarah felt the storm inside her coiling, building, gathering strength in her limbs and heat in her chest, until she felt she might explode if she didn't move soon. She waited, she breathed, she listened, and then, in a moment so subtle that no one noticed at first, she took one step backward, then another, blending into the movement of servants clearing the tables. No overseer watched her. Everyone was entranced by Marcus's performance, and in that small window of distraction, Sarah slipped behind the veranda, moved through the narrow path along the kitchen wall, crossed the yard with silent precision, and disappeared into the shadows of the storage sheds. Once hidden from view, she broke into a run, massive, powerful strides, carrying her across the plantation, faster than she had ever dared to move. For the first time in her life, she was running not because someone ordered her to, not because she was being chased, but because she was heading toward a destiny she had chosen for herself. Every breath felt like fire. Every step like thunder. She clutched the master key so tightly it pressed into her skin. And as she reached the livestock gate, her heart pounding, her muscles trembling with readiness, she understood one truth with perfect clarity. She might not escape tonight, but tonight, the Harrow's control over her ended forever. As Sarah forced the key into the lock, her hands trembling with fury and anticipation, the rusted metal resisted for a moment before giving way with a loud click that seemed to echo across the darkening fields like the crack of a gunshot. And in that instant she knew there was no turning back, no returning to the silent endurance that had defined her 14 years of life beneath the crushing weight of the Harrow's control. She swung the gate open and slipped through the narrow gap at the base of the fence, where the boards had weakened from years of moisture and neglect. But before she could take more than 3 steps into the marshy grass beyond the boundary, a shout pierced the air behind her, sharp, panicked. Unmistakably Reinhardt's voice, and Sarah's heart lurched with the sudden knowledge that her disappearance had been noticed far earlier than she had hoped. She ran anyway, her long legs thundering through the tall grass, her breath cutting the thick humidity with desperate force. But the moment she heard the dogs bark from the main yard, she understood the full danger closing in on her. The overseers shouted orders, torches blazed to life, and the chaos of men scrambling in every direction erupted behind her. Yet she kept running, fueled by more than fear, fueled by the memory of every humiliation she had endured, every cold measurement, every future Marcus had tried to carve into her body before she had even become a woman. The marshland's wet ground sucked at her feet, slowing her, pulling at her ankles as if the earth itself were torn between helping her and holding her back. And when she slipped and slammed into the mud, the distant glow of torches grew larger, closer, accompanied by the pounding footsteps of men who believed they owned her life, her future, her children, her bloodline. She pushed herself upright, slipping again, scrambling, panting, her lungs burning as she forced her legs to move. But the shouts behind her multiplied, growing louder as men spread out to cut off her escape route. She staggered into deeper marsh water, chest heaving, arms shaking, and just as she reached a section of reeds dense enough to conceal her, a sound sliced through the night, a gunshot, followed by a spray of mud erupting inches from her feet. She gasped, stumbling backward, and another shot rang out, this one glancing off a fallen log near her knee. She dropped to a crouch, heart hammering so loudly she thought it might shatter her ribs, and peered through the reeds to see Marcus himself stepping through the tall grass toward her. His face twisted with a rage she had never seen before, a rage born not from fear of losing her life, but from fear of losing the creature he believed he had engineered. "Come out," he shouted, his voice cracking with fury. "I made you what you are." Those words ignited something volcanic inside Sarah. She rose slowly from the reeds, towering above the grass, her chest lifting with a slow, deliberate breath that carried 14 years of buried anger. And for the first time in her life, she looked Marcus in the eye, not as a captive, but as an equal. No, as something far stronger. The men around him hesitated, their guns trembling, unsure if they were aiming at a girl or a force of nature. Marcus, flushed with humiliation, raised his pistol at her with trembling hands, shouting at her to kneel, to submit, to obey. But she did not move, not even an inch. Lightning cracked across the distant sky, illuminating the scene in a pale, ghostly flash that made Sarah appear impossibly large, almost mythic, as if the storm itself had risen to stand behind her. In that frozen moment the dogs barked wildly, the men stepped back in fear, and Marcus's grip faltered just long enough. Sarah lunged forward with a speed none of them had ever seen, closing the distance between them in seconds, grabbing the gun from his hands with a force that snapped his wrist, sending him screaming into the mud. The men surged toward her in panic, but she swung the pistol like a club, knocking 2 of them to the ground before the third hesitated, his courage dissolving the instant Sarah roared, not a cry of fear, not a cry of pain, but the deep, powerful roar of someone reclaiming her life after years of forced silence. The men scrambled away, dragging Marcus with them as he screamed orders no one followed, and Sarah turned and ran, deeper into the marsh, then into the thick woods that bordered the far edge of the plantation, where the trees swallowed her massive silhouette and the darkness embraced her like something that had been waiting for her arrival. She did not stop running until her legs shook with exhaustion, until her breath came in shuddering bursts, until the shouts behind her faded into distant echoes swallowed by the night. And when she finally collapsed beneath an old cypress tree, she looked up through the tangled moss at the sky storm clouds drifting above her like great silent witnesses, and for the first time in her life, she felt the weight of her own future resting entirely in her own hands. She knew she could never return, that Marcus would hunt her for years, that the price of her freedom might be higher than she could yet imagine. But she also knew she had done something no one believed possible. She had broken the chain, she had outrun the legacy that sought to control her, she had chosen herself. And as dawn began to break, soft and pale across the horizon, Sarah rose again, not as number 47, not as an experiment, not as a breeding project, but as a young woman walking into a world that had never expected her to survive long enough to see it. Her story did not end in bondage, it began in freedom, and with each step she took into the vast, uncharted land beyond the plantation, the legend of the girl they tried to engineer, and the woman she became despite them, took root in the soil of a future that belonged only to her.